Comenzamos. Oh. Va. Venga. Bueno, muchas gracias a todos por venir en un día complicado de agendas porque había otra presentación del libro. De hecho, vengo corriendo de allí. Thank you very much, Stephen, for being here again. You're always welcome here. But I continue speaking Spanish. Bueno, todos, me parece que es un poco tontería volver a explicar quiénes son Sergison Bates. Todos conocéis su obra desde hace ya mucho tiempo. Pero yo cuando los conocí, casi los conocí simultáneamente con unos proyectos teóricos que tenían que eran bastante bellos, o yo como editor me fijaba mucho en ellos, que eran los papers. Hicieron 3 volúmenes de papers, uno del 2001, el primero del 2001 hasta el 2015, ¿no? 2001 and 2015, if I don't remember. Y en ellos escribían los dos autores, ¿no? Jonathan y Stephen. Y creo que este libro es una continuación un poco de los papers, pero ya escribe solo Stephen. Son estos, veréis que hay mucho tema español, o sea, hay mucha arquitectura española, o sea, se nota que vienes mucho de continuo y que conoces la arquitectura española, la arquitectura española, y nada, os invito a que os lo veáis, que se lee con mucho gusto. Steven pasará unas diapositivas, un texto breve y después hablará con Beth Cadeferro. Thank you, Beth. Gracias, Beth.
Gracias, Moisés. Okay. Friends, it really is just talking to friends, which is great. I'm really pleased to be here because Barcelona is a special place for me. I think the book demonstrates it's part of my biography, let's say. I wanted to share some thoughts about a selected paper in the book, which is called The Mysteries of the Ceiling. I wanted to write about the ceiling for maybe 20 years. And eventually, when this project emerged as possible, it was a chance to talk about the ceiling. This is a set design in the Victoria and Albert Museum, which I visited many years ago, and no phones please, that moved me. It is a house in Bromley by Bow, an Elizabethan house that was dismantled, and part of it was moved to the museum. And it shows an exquisite ceiling. It is in some ways an everyday house. I mean, it's not a rich person's house, but it is a merchant's house. And the ceiling is made of plaster, and it's made by traveling plasterers from France. To make this, they work with lime plaster. They press the plaster into carved wooden molds. And then the separate sections are joined together, fixed to the ceiling laths. And it took 1 year for the plaster to dry completely. But the consequence in candlelight, which was the light source of this domestic setting, gave the ceiling life and mystery. In 2001, I went to the first Unilever installation at the new Tate Modern, and I discovered the work of your compatriot, Juan Muñez. This is called Double Bind. And looking up between this sort of black foreground and the distant view of the power station's roof, there is an interstitial space revealed. It's a half-hidden world of mystery. You know, Muniz presents us with a mysterious, vaguely familiar space between things. And we feel as if we were invited to glimpse something that we're not really meant to see. It is also an occupied world between things. And in my reading of Muniz and his work, I came across some sketches. He worked often with photographs which he distorted in their geometry and drew over. And one of the sketches was of Francesco Borromini's dome at the church of San Carlo Alto Quattro Fontane. You know, Muniz had a broad range of references, and I always enjoy the way that artists feel very free to work with reference and to manipulate and distort, let's say, and reinterpret. But what we see in the real surface, a photograph of the ceiling itself, is a rich spatial complexity. There is somehow an evocation of the infinite. It directs the viewer away from their everyday experience, and towards a more transcendent one. And the shadow effects, with this deep coffering and the side light in which there are two windows placed high up on the side, sort of accentuate the body, the ceiling as a body. Peter Smithson, in a little pamphlet that I have called The Persistence of Ways, wrote, "Somehow in our time, the ceiling pretends to be invisible. There is usually the attempt to make walls speak with floor, but ceiling is left a jumble of extracts, light fittings, conduits, air supply pipes, unrelated to the sense of use. Pause, stop, about to turn right, go up, go down. If the floor is to be available for manipulation, to give signals to the eye and to the feet of the changing uses of the way, then the walls and the ceiling need to follow. They need consideration in a new way." And much of Peter's writing has been very formative for me in my life as an architect. And it, particularly in this case, with his invitation to consider a loose structure of ways through buildings that suggests a sense of wandering. And the ceiling could be part of that experience, a spatial surface to work on, to make a figure within the space that gives it purpose beyond its use. On the right-hand side are some sketches of the Smithsons for the Acropolis Museum that explored very much a relationship of an active ceiling. And on the left, a picture that I'm sure you know of Rem Koolhaas's ceiling room installation at the Giardinieri as part of the Biennale in 2014. It shows this cross-section of a ubiquitous contemporary office ceiling hovering close to your head, revealing a cascade of ductwork and pipes, cables, and sprinkler systems above it. And then beyond, soaring above and dramatically lit, a majestic dome, frescoed and richly colored. And Koolhaas wrote, "The ceiling used to be decorative, a symbolic plane, a place invested with intense iconography. Now it has become an entire factory of equipment that enables us to exist, a space so deep that it begins to compete with the architecture. It is a domain over which architects have lost all control, a zone surrendered to other professionals." Needless to say, I find the Smithsons' broadening of the ceiling's potential much more optimistic and encouraging, and have been reflecting over the years on ways that are possible to bring an expression to the enclosing elements in the making of rooms in our own work. This is a drawing of the Acropolis Museum where you can clearly see this interesting relationship between the wandering of the floor and the ceiling. But in our work, which is really here, these references all relate to domestic work. So this is not about public ceilings, but about the making of rooms ultimately. As part of a broader concept of claddings and linings, we explored how the suspended ceiling can create a defined space to the a defined shape rather to the space below, and while creating a useful plenum for the running of services above it. The inner form becomes detached from the outer structural frame. The thinness of the ceiling surface is concealed, except in section drawings, by a continuous plastered surface. And we explored this in this holiday house in Dorset, but also in the double house of Stevenage, the craft centre in Ruthin, and the house in Cadiquez. And in this case, you see the lighting of the house is incorporated in the ceiling, and certain interfaces with the existing structure, very much inspired by the work of Frank Gehry, the meeting of the two, of the sort of artificial lining and the existing structure, is revealed. And in the section you see the rooms become defined by the shape of their ceiling. Working with a strong profile expressed a greater three-dimensional depth in the ceiling surface in this, actually the ceiling of a swimming pool in a large house in Kent. It remains non-structural. It is, let's say, defined with a certain tectonic. There is a hierarchy of elements, but it is about its body, a presentation of it as a body in itself, and not as a structural entity. It also contains the mechanical air, which is distributed along very linear recesses that give a kind of purpose also to the roof. This is the garden building in Merisworth in Kent, as I say, a ceiling of dark stained cassettes that gives this profile, like a new topography hovering over a swimming pool. The third, let's say, approach I've noticed is one in which there is some kind of expression of a structural field. Territories are connected, each defined by a joisted ceiling, which is sized and it's spaced to express the scale of the space below, not just sized by its span, but it's sometimes adjusted in order to create extra depth or less depth. We explored this visual structuring of the ceiling in this project of rural housing in Felsted in Essex, where rough sawn joists are laid out as fields above your head, their direction changing in accordance with the space below to form a fabric-like structure. And also in the courtyard housing in Lavender Hill, effectively a kind of open plan of rooms defined by these rough sawn joists and double layered beams. This book is conceived as a pocket book. It measures 18 by 13 centimeters. It's small in the hand. It's a small ecological footprint in the environment. It is a book that can be slipped into your pocket while traveling on the metro or on the train, or to be read in bed. And it reminds me slightly of those beautiful second-hand paperbacks, Japanese paperbacks that you see the character in Wim Wenders' Perfect Days, Horayama, reading at night. before he sleeps. The cover is moss green. It's binding cloth, the cloth that is usually bonded to a card to give it stiffness. Its thickness is similar to the thickness of the paper within. And this paper is Offenbach, 60-gram paper. Offenbach, a town in Germany that makes paper for Bibles. This is their sort of, that's the source of this thin, translucent, very soft, silky paper. And combined with the open-threaded binding, the consequence is a sort of floppy, weighty in the hand. And I've noticed that people hold it like differently to other things. You become more conscious, perhaps, a little bit more conscious. And I think to myself, that's what we should do, isn't it? That is the role of the architect, to bring a little extra consciousness. It was designed by Jane Chipchase, who I am very privileged to work with and live with. She's made many projects. She'd be really annoyed with me saying that. But the type is Calvert. That's designed by Margaret Calvert, who is a masterful graphic designer. She, for example, designed the road signs in the whole of the United Kingdom in the 60s. And in the same period, she designed this serif font. Funnily enough, it was designed for a new town in France. So a town in France was a new town. They invited this famous graphic designer to invent a font for their identity. And it was eventually rejected because they said it was too English. But Margaret Calvert was the professor of graphic design when Jane Chipchase and myself were studying at the Royal College of Art. She has a special place in both our minds. And that's it at the moment. But we were going to have a conversation. So.
Wait.
Shall I take the microphone? Do I need a microphone? Can you hear me?
Well, thank you, Stephen. It's such a great privilege to be here today with you and with all these friends. Yes, some of them are guilty of our admiration for you and for your work, like Emiliano, who in our record choice meetings with Elvira always tells about your work and about your wiseness. I'm so grateful to be sharing the joy of the presentation of this book. And I was recalling when we first met. It was a fortuitous encounter at Ibabi's jury in 2021. I was telling you before that I still had to ask for a vaccine certificate to come to Palma. I guess you had to do the same. And it's wonderful to think how that encounter has evolved into I guess, a long-lasting friendship that involves our two families. So fortunate. And yeah, I perfectly remember my feelings when I met you at the first jury meeting in Palma, and perfectly remember how I described your attitudes to Ramon when I came back home in regards to the numerous and diverse components of the tribunal, and in relationship to understanding and comparing the big amount of proposals that we had to understand and that were competing to win the contest. You were the president of the jury, but if I recall my memories of that day, I can see you again sitting around that huge table where a big amount of people were having a debate, and you were mainly silent, observing and listening to the rituals of information and explanations given by the organizers of the competition that were talking in Spanish. I sat next to you, hoping to help you to translate the main parts of the conversation in case you would miss any relevant aspect of the procedures. And when the process of studying the project started, you kept talking very little. I was really impressed by this constant silence. And you started to draw small diagrams on a beautiful pocket notebook. And the pencil that you were using had a very soft lid. And your schemes were very beautiful since they were very synthetic. Various representatives of the administrations that would manage the future buildings attended the debates too. And apart from listening and drawing, you did ask certain relevant questions, but really a few, to them, and listened with a profound respect and interest their needs and concerns. Your silence and focused study of the proposals, together with the key questions you asked, were enough to configure an aureola of respect and real attention towards your few interventions. When I got back to Girona, I remember sharing with Ramon the admiration that your behavior had produced in me, and the feeling of having learned a great deal of things while being your personal translator during those days. Yeah, in fact, I remember a special moment when I was almost like shocked that you talk so little. which
Doesn't sound like me at all.
No, but it was like this. I perfectly remember. And I thought that it was so interesting, no? This contention, no? And this being really interested in observing and understanding the dynamics that everything was taking. And I remember that I said to you, I don't know, maybe if you want to say something, I can help you translate. And you said, no, I'm keeping my powder dry.
Powder dry, yeah. I was just about to say, I remember saying that to you. I'm keeping my powder dry.
I don't know, maybe everyone knows what the meaning of this expression is, but maybe you can translate it. Or explain it.
Yeah, not revealing too much too soon.
And yeah, I understood that you were keeping like first of all, you were deeply trying to understand the proposals, but afterwards you were trying to build like a known vision to then be able to explain it at the right moment. No? So all this is so, I don't know, I thought it was such an intelligent. And 4 years later, I find myself next to you again. And I've been fortunate enough to have met you several times these past years. And we'll try to have a small conversation about this beautiful book. The reading of the pages that you have so carefully written and Jane has so preciously put together brings me back to that prudent, sharp and wise man that I met once in Mallorca. That made me think how relevant culture is in all its expressions. and how important can the witness of culture be, and its great capacity of transformation, which I think is what the potential of the book, of writing a book. No, I imagine the effort that something like this means, but it's so beautiful to imagine the capacity of transformation that all the words contained in this precious object can. It's nice the way in which all these thoughts came back to my mind while reading your book, and to realize the reverberation that the word silent that you use in your first chapter when you qualify certain architects, that you say remain as constant mentors in your journey of discovery from one project to another, which I thought it's such a precise and beautiful way to describe our job. You know, that a journey of discovery from one project to another, and how there are certain silent architects, no, that maybe afterwards we can say their names, that remain as constant mentors. Because I think that one of the aspects that impressed me the most was your silence, and I now realize that silence might be one of the entrance doors of 3 essential values that I found in your book, and that might be the starting point of our conversation. First of one is study. I think that there's a vast knowledge in these pages. You are such a good describer of things and situations and spaces. But what we find here, it's not a mere observation. It's much more than this. It's a real cultivated knowledge. And that's why you can be so precise about everything that you explain, because you have this safe basement of knowing. And yeah, it's something we sometimes talk with some colleagues at school when we try to teach architecture, which is something quite complex to do, on how young architects should remember to study projects. Yeah. Because we study all these topics that of course are essential to, like physics and maths and history. I mean, all of them absolutely essential, but sometimes it's difficult to find students that come to you with references or with a deep knowledge of a design that has impacted in their minds, or that has in some way helped them to go forward with their decisions. And I don't know what I was wondering.
May I say something? I mean, as a teacher, but really as a practicing architect, to investigate the origin of things has always interested me. Whether that is about etymology, you know, why a word becomes a word, but also about elements, spatial elements, objects. And I, as a teacher, I really promote to my students the need to sort of penetrate beyond the first layer, and because I feel that there are many, there's much to learn, and there are many, let's say, new interpretations that are available to a designer if you start to sort of scrape away the surface. I mean, there's a paper on the table which I wrote at the invitation of Javier Montes. I just wanted to talk about the table, because the table has transformed, you know, historically its role and its social role has transformed. We think of a table in a room that we don't move, but the origin of a table was that it was never static. It was leaning against the wall and used in a very pragmatic way, and it was light. The legs were separated from the top, and bit by bit, its position in the world, in the world of ideas and the domestic world changed, and it became then heavy. It became a kind of family important symbol. And my observation is that despite the changes in society and the way that we live, it's still interesting. The table is still one of the most important parts of the domestic setting. But I think to place any of these things within a historical context is just intelligent. I mean, it's helpful to understand. I mean, I'm interested in, and many people here are interested in, the plan. Jose just showed Robin Evans's seminal essay, Figures, Doors and Passages, this morning. And I mean, you know, plans come from somewhere. And it's fascinating to see this sort of cross-fertilization, cross-culture, cross-time. And ideas become less important and then more important. And there's a recycling of things. And I think if you can become dexterous with understanding the origins and what was relevant. You know, a room upon room plan, people dismiss because there's no privacy, but that doesn't make it not interesting. It doesn't make it not useful as a way of working things out. So to me, I've not only seen this as a teacher, but really as a practitioner, and I'm fascinated. And of course, the writing allows me to make these observations. So there is a lot of information. There is a lot of things in there. I like to share those things because they excite me, and I guess they'll excite other people, and maybe other readers will have a very different interpretation, which could be also interesting for them. But this creates a sort of bedrock in which one can then explore spatial ideas or social ideas, because we do, as architects, deal with culture, and we need to understand it. You know, it's not what's just the latest news on social media. I mean, you know, which of course we have to help the younger generation see beyond that.
I totally agree. I mean, there are so many things that we will comment in a while, but I wouldn't like to lose like the two words that I want to say before we continue.
Okay, yeah.
The second characteristic, I think, is the delicious writing. I mean, it's so beautiful how you choose the words, and the wideness of your vocabulary and the rhythm of the writing. And I have asked Flora to tell me how is it called when you present a character in cinema.
Yes.
And it's called character introduction. Because Flora always tells me that it's very important for a film director to be good at introducing the characters of the film, no? And I think that you do it in a so refined way, so well, not to introduce each character of the play and in each text, and to give each one of them the right hierarchy in the explanation. And
I feel, in this sense, I feel very lucky that I write in English, because English, I feel, has a lot of ambiguity, a lot of suggestion. It isn't in a way so clear as other, say, Germanic languages. And I really enjoy, for me, the inspiration for writing came from Peter Smithson, as well as reading other sort of fiction writers. But primarily, when I was given many years ago, a book of The Solar Pavilion by about Upper Lawn, and it was given to me by Fernando Villavecchia. It still has the library stamp on the inside cover. But this book is like a diary, and it was written both by Peter and by Alison Smithson. And I had never read architecture described like this, in a sort of poetic, incorrect English, deeply atmospheric and humble and sort of vulnerable way. Because architecture was meant to be certain, and it was meant to be absolutely correct, and quite hard, it seemed to me. And here was something that I really understood. You know, this was vulnerable, but beautiful, and it appealed to myself. But I felt there were cultural connections also, with interest in the picturesque and these other, in a way, say, influences on sort of certainly English artistic culture. So my first paper, which is in this book because it was reissued in Italian, and this gave me the excuse to put it in here. But because the book was, as it was developing, became more and more autobiographical, I wanted to put my first ever proper text, which is called Way to Work, in here. And way to work itself is an ambiguity, because it was both about my way to work. How did I choose this way or this way to the tube station? Because I had these routes, and I, for some reason, would decide one or the other. So I started to write about why did I do that? But of course, in the writing of that very thing, by observing very carefully the world around myself, I realized it was a way to work, you know, a way of working. It sort of established observation as, you know, the beginning of everything and the end of everything. So this ambiguity was special to me, and it's not always easy, you know. For me, it's always a bit problematic when texts are translated. I can imagine it's very difficult. The other thing I must say is that I have one of my colleague in the office, Marina Aldrovandi, is an assistant of mine. We work very closely together, and she edits my writing. In fact, she edits Jonathan's writing as well. And she is like a very scary teacher, you know. But you give your homework, and I know that she will not, because she is Italian. She speaks 4 languages, and she writes English absolutely perfectly. And I give my writing, and she says, "Well, that's not right." You know. And of course, I know it's not right. So we have this little like fight. Do I give in to make it correct, or do I say no? When I say it must be incorrect, her face, it's really, I really have to believe it. I really have to want it to be incorrect, because the way she looks at me, you want that, and it's going to go out into the world like that. It's so. I mean, Marina is part of this. You know, as I say in the book throughout, 30 years of collaboration. You know, this is somehow, you could say, a solo project, but it's ultimately describing a life of collaboration, as is, of course, the book itself. And that is the very essence of the role of the architect, I think. So, you know, in a way, what is mine? I mean, I'm part of something. I feel I know what I can contribute, but I know that I can only contribute certain things. You know, there are other people who do other things amazingly.
Talking about vulnerability, this connects with my third idea, which is the sense of intimacy.
Yes.
I think there's a very deep sense of intimacy in the reading of this book, and there's a great generosity from your part to share not only some of these very personal experiences and understandings and like places that have impacted in your, but also to share in a way your methodology, and to share your sources, and to share these mentors, no?
Yeah.
To share, to be really open and in a way vulnerable.
Yeah.
But I think that we will agree that fragility and delicacy are maybe the main aspects that define all of us as humans.
Yes.
And so
also, I think it maybe is something to do with one's experience. I mean, I find it easy now to express vulnerability. I mean, maybe when you were younger, it's more difficult when you're trying to say prove yourself. But the idea of sharing and the idea of declaring that we're all vulnerable, we're all quite fragile, and what we do is fragile. It can be lost quite easily. Is really about the creative process. So to me, it's of course I show a lot in it, but
there's this passage. Sorry.
No, please. No, I wasn't going to say. I didn't know what to say. Tell me.
No, there's this passage when you talk about this elderly house.
Yes.
And you recognize that afterwards it was like finished by some interior designers, and that certain things were not respected, no? And
because I think many people will identify with that. That to me it's not interesting to present an artificial reality, and of course we're bombarded with that all the time, not only in architecture but in life generally. And I feel that that's what happened. To make an amazing plan like that, there's a price to pay, which was that eventually when the management changed in that client, they didn't understand. So they just needed to change everything because back to safe territory. In that case, that's a story to be told, But I agree with you. I mean, of course, it was not easy to tell everybody that the floor was wrong and the doors are the wrong detail, but there's still something in it.
This brings me to another reflection, that is how beautifully chained are all the chapters together.
Yes.
It's it's very nice because the topics like travel fluidly from one text to the other, and sometimes you even find like references that you have already read about, or topics that come back from another perspective, but it's so nice to revisit them in another text, and to realize which are like the perennial interests that come back and back and back again in a lot of chapters, no?
There are 21 texts. They're not written to be in a single book. So, of course, there are 3 or 4 I wrote for the book, but in the end, it was about curation. And at the end, I make reference to the idea of an album, a solo album, a band, a band member going to make their own thing. And of course, you put songs, when you make an album, the order of the songs is very carefully thought through. And to me, this is also, of course, part of the freedom that I had on this. Because in the other papers 2, papers 3, where I was also, Jonathan's writings were combined with my writings, it was much more difficult to curate.
Sure.
Because we were writing about sometimes the same thing, but in a different way. But it wasn't possible to create a kind of narrative, I found. And so this allowed me to make that narrative. And combined with the paper, with the show through, you sort of are still seeing the future paper or the paper before with the page open. I mean, there's a sort of... the show through is a very important part of the design of the book.
It's true. I hadn't thought about it, but this connection is physical and visual also, no? And one of the topics that you are touching several times, also when you tell us about the history of certain things or certain places or certain objects, which is beautiful. I think it's so beautiful, these moments when you become like an historian.
No.
Because the origin of lots of things is so simple in some way. It's so good to remember.
Yeah.
And I think there's a very strong sense of atemporality, no? Of your interest for atemporality. It's something I remember I completely understood when I lived in Rome for 1 year, lucky me, long ago, when I was studying, thanks to the Erasmus program. That suddenly there's one day when you realize that it's the same since millennia ago.
Yeah, yeah.
It's like the time like comes together, no? And suddenly 2000 years ago and now it's same time. It's not so much about when things were done, but about what were the aims and what were the...
I mean, I think many people in this room will believe or support this view that continuity is essential, and you know, as architects, we place ourselves within a cultural continuity, and you know, that to me is an important role and, let's say, responsibility to appreciate that you are part of a temporal structure, let's say. But I also think the temporality appears elsewhere in a different way. In the text, towards the intelligent ruin, you know, there's the idea of temporal layers of a building. To understand a building as a set of layers that have various lives, from permanent to ephemeral, is an interesting direction to understand how to work within this climate emergency and a more sort of environmentally light-footed way. So I see the temporality at different scales somehow. You know, it's also a kind of strategy for thinking about making new work.
Sure, I am looking for that scheme. I don't know if you know in which page.
Which one?
The one that tells about the structure will last like 150 years.
Well, towards the intelligent ruin.
I have found it so beautiful and so interesting. No, I don't know if we might show it.
I think you passed it.
Did I? Yeah, please. But it's such a graphic, powerful, no? Do you want to explain it?
Well, I mean, it's not my diagram. It's Stuart Brand, How Buildings Learn. But it's really part of a culture of ideas. He wasn't alone in thinking and beginning to consider the building. I like these. There's stuff, which is 7 years, which is the ephemeral. The space plan is 15 years. The services are 25. The skin is 50. The structure is 200, and the site is forever. But I mean, it's quite simplistic. But I think there's a potential strategy in that thinking, and certainly the projects that we are two particular in here that we're working on are really informed by that idea of layering, of permanence and ephemerality. But the role of the architect is to decide what is the permanent, because it isn't always the structure. You know, it isn't. You know, the ephemeral is not always the facade. Sometimes the facade needs to be a 200-year facade. Other times it doesn't. And I think we have to make those decisions. But there's certainly, if we are trying to build in a resilient way, so we use lots of energy to build the building, but can it become useful for a long time and become loved and become part of the city and therefore resilient? It can, if it can be able to be undress itself and adapt to a changing climate or a user, whatever. So, you know, it's something that I'm talking about in our office when we're working on a project. I'm asking, what is the second and third life of this building? You know, how I ask that question early, so that we are designing something with a bit more of a sort of infrastructural character to it, not too precise, not too specific.
This maybe brings the conversation to the room, which is one of the big protagonists of the book, no, as the basic cell of architecture, and how you defend that spatial richness can derive just from its dimensions and proportions.
Yeah.
And the position the relevance of the position and dimensions of the openings, both doors and windows. And I would like to use the word sacred to talk about the act of opening a window in a wall, or the act of opening a door. Because I understand that you defend that in this very simple but powerful act or gesture, there must be a lot of intelligence and also nobility. You talk about the need for a window that is not scared, and the way in which you talk in several chapters about rooms and about this room that is mainly like an empty space prepared for the unsuspected. I think there's also a claim for a certain austerity and a certain spirituality of the space. And I think it's not casual that you talk also about monasteries and that you talk about these spaces where use can be sometimes moved from one place to another, but there's like a very solid and durable infrastructure that allows for a big diversity of lives, no?
Yeah, I mean, rooms have always interested me, and I'm not alone. There are many architects working in beautiful ways in exploring the potential of a room. You know, maybe it's strangely originated as a bit of a reaction to open plan and sort of broad spaces with little definition, and almost a rolling reaction, you know, back to the importance of threshold and a delineation of a space. To call it sacred, I mean, that might be innate, but I mean, most of the references are towards domestic architecture, and I do feel that there is a spiritual dimension to domestic space. I think that must be the case, because this word intimacy, which I really, is an important word for me. The intimacy of the domestic space, what happens, you know, you home, what is home? And I describe what I think home is, but home is something for everybody, but it certainly, it has a certain kind of otherness, you know, it's a way of recharging your batteries. It's a refuge in some way. So in this aspect, there is a kind of highly conscious aspect to it. And you mentioned doors and windows. I mean, in the early days when we had very small projects, but were very interested in the psychological aspects of architecture, as we still are, and the sociological aspects of architecture, we found that something extraordinary happens if you lift a handle beyond it, above its normal conventional height. Something changes. The proportions of the room change. Most importantly, the action, the individual action, you become a bit more conscious. And as I said earlier, to me, this is a really interesting field of investigation. And I don't believe as projects get bigger or more complex or more political or whatever, that these things are not relevant. You know, they are the bedrock of what we do. They are armory somehow, you know. And the room is the sort of bedrock of what I believe, you know, architecture is. The claddings and linings reference was, you know, Jonathan and I always found it great interest in recognizing that the making of a room has a sort of autonomy from the making of a facade or the making of a building in the city. You know, that it's useful if there's a bit of slackness, you know, slippage between those two things. That's always interested me, and it's partly about the mystery. You know, partly I like it that architecture isn't, you know, evident, isn't so clear and obvious, and the old people's complex cellular network plan was partly devised to create a complex interior. You know, it was consciously one that you had to discover or get lost in. You know, that it was the domain of the owner of that home, not of any visitor, a carer, or that you have to be invited in progressively. This to me is really interesting.
It is. Yeah, to imagine in some way a house as a landscape, no?
Yes.
And well, it's beautiful, the expression, a society of rooms.
Yes.
Because it seems that you are giving like a name to the room, no? A personal character to each one of them, no? And they establish certain relationships within each other. I don't know how much time we have.
If other people want to ask a question.
Yeah, sure. I was also wondering if you would like to talk about a text that I haven't been able to read yet, but that seems to me super suggesting,
About
which is The Land.
The Old Land.
Yeah.
Yes.
Would you like to?
Yeah, just to say, at the end of the book, or not quite the end, there's a very short text called The Old Land. And I used that like this, you know, in Zurich. And I described that lockdown helped me discover my own land, you know, England, because we were stuck and we started walking. And I started to rediscover the old land. But it occurred to me also, it has done for many years, that those silent architects, those amazing silent architects, Leverance, Piccionis, Caesar, they're masters of the ground. I mean, they are architects of the ground. And my advocation in this short text is that as architects, we should be architects of the ground. You know, we should become much more sensitive to how buildings rest. Let's say, we should honor, in a way, honor the ground and be very careful with its geology and its archaeology. And this is, let's say, a little door that's kicked open for my teaching going forward. And these things are not concluded. You know, it's just like a way, an opening. And I'm particularly interested in this relationship to the terrain. I talk in the references that include the shift by Sarah demonstrates, you know, that by intervening into a piece of ground which is almost always artificial anyway, you know, it's a piece of productive land. It's almost nothing in where we build is original land. It's already made and processed somehow. But in intervening, new relationships are established within that space, and a new type of terrain is made. The Maiden Castle, the great earthwork, the prehistoric earthwork, of which there's a drawing made by two of my students in Munich, demonstrates that, you know, land is modified, adjusted for new purpose, but it's still, I mean, the land is still the protagonist within that context, and I find this really interesting. So the old land, which has the sort of private importance to me, is also about opportunity, about establishing new strategy for making work, and as a teaching position also for young architects to be a bit more, you know, precise. I mean, we've all as teachers have seen drawings of these flat, you know, these sections with a flat line and a house on top, you know, as if there's a tabula rasa, you know. This is a ridiculous situation, and there are many opportunities in that space. Okay.
I think all this tells about this kind of Renaissance character that you have. Know that sometimes you write like an historian, sometimes like an anthropologist, sometimes like a critic, no, an art critic, or sometimes like a collectionist of.
But I'm not any of those things, and I'm certainly not an academic. I mean, this is of course the strange thing about this book. It's not, serious sort of academia. It's not. I've never wanted to try. And I've always wanted the freedom to write in this very loose way. And Jonathan and I found a kind of gap to do that. But it's important that, it's not a historian's writing by any means. Even my son, who's a psychologist, writes in this scientific way. It's so perfect, and he reads my text. What's this, kind of strange, loose stuff. But in the end, it's to do with a kind of process of thinking. I've never felt that as an architect, my only role is to construct. It's also to write and to teach, to reflect and to research. And of course, writing provides a kind of discipline to make a certain commitment to ideas, because you have to put them down. In the end, you have to write. And I have a love-hate relationship to writing. It's the most difficult thing. And then sometimes it comes together, and then it's the most amazing thing. So it's it's like a building. It's like making buildings. It's very hard, but also deeply rewarding.
I don't know if I can say like a last phrase, or before anyone wants to comment something. Or
would anyone like to ask a question? Yeah. I could say, the first text does explain a little bit, or certainly it describes, it's used as a way of talking about a way of working. That when we work, we sort of put a stake in the ground. That's clear. And we move forward a bit tentatively, and almost like a climber. You find your foothold or your finger, and you put another stake. And as you get confident, or as your ideas develop, you move that pole isn't important anymore. You move it. So these sort of this physical act of the tent poles in the ground, for me, describe very much my how I see my own sort of process of design or whatever. And I use it in relation to a very beautiful sketch of Kodurk of the Ugaldi, the site of the Ugaldi house, in which he marks these things. And I kind of see them almost as his poles in the ground that kind of a particular view or a tree, or these sort of sketching out the terrain in which he will work. But the actual phrase, I always forget the name of this artist, but the phrase came up in the office when we were working on the Leuven Theatre, which is a project we are soon to start in construction in Belgium. And we were talking about certain performance artists, and one of my colleagues mentioned, tent poles in the ground. And no one really noticed, and I thought, tent poles in the ground, that's it. What's that? And I asked about it, and he thought that he read this expression in an interview with a Spanish filmmaker from the Basque country. Her name is Leida Lecchundi. Do you know her? She works between America and the Basque country, and apparently her sort of connection with this expression was about traces, about working and leaving traces with your work somehow. That everything is relevant and nothing's left. So I think she describes that as her journey through her work goes, there are marks that are left in the path of her work. So we're both quite kind of beautiful. For me, it was easy to think you lift them and move them, but she leaves them. So I wanted to. I didn't want the book to be called Papers 4 or texts. I wanted it to feel like many of the texts are sort of suggestive and a bit other and open to interpretation. So I hope that answers it.
And talking about filmmakers again, now it came to my mind a phrase that once I heard from a good friend of ours, Isaki Lacuesta, who is a filmmaker, and he explained in a little lecture that, of course, the works of others influence our work and our vision of things, but what mostly influence our minds and our hearts and our bodies is our own work. And to me, it was interesting in the sense that a sense of responsibility,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
no? That taking care of what you do
Yeah.
will transform you.
Yeah.
So it's nice to think about being aware of this self-transformation, that of course is always in relationship
Of course.
with your but
absolutely.
Like, this sense of responsibility, I think, is also very much
Yes. Yeah.
perceivable, no, in all these words.
I mean, I feel like we're very lucky as architects that we are in service, you know, in the sense that we provide a service for the betterment of society or for who we're working for. But there is also self-learning and self-discovery, or there can be, in the work that we make. We're very privileged that it can be a very private, but also very public sort of activity that we undertake. I personally, you know, I feel like we have the best job in the world, you know? But we have to work for it, of course. You always have to work for the good things. So, yeah.
I don't know if it's a moment for the last phrase that I had. Do you want to say anything else? Is there any chapter that I haven't talked about? Or
well, I just would say that, I mean, there are two important texts that, from my point of view, are kind of really relevant and in a way create a sort of platform for certainly understanding our own work of our practice in London and Brussels at the moment. One is Towards the Intelligent Ruin, and the other is Reimagining Reuse. And they both are attempts to further a kind of definition of what sustainability might mean. Because, you know, we know it's a terrible phrase, it's overused and doesn't mean very much, but the need to work with a lighter footprint, a lighter ecological footprint within this climate emergency is essential. We have, and both these texts talk about thinking differently, and we are consciously thinking differently in our practice, either towards reuse, of which, you know, we're of course promoting, but there's always the need for new buildings. And what I don't agree with the kind of general debate of only reuse is that there's still a need to make something new. And the question is, how do you make something new now, within this climate condition? And those two texts are quite important to me, but they read as a pair, you know. So I think one is after the other in the book.
I haven't reached them yet.
You haven't got there. It's near the end. Okay. Thank you.
No, I was going to say that in times of permanent noise and incessant shouting, we wish to listen to whom speaks with deepness and knowledge, avid as we are of the consciousness that makes us human. Thank you.
Thank you. It's very sweet.